Hello, everyone. It's me, Andrew. I'm here at Star Cottage Studio. And yeah, hopefully, you all have been having a great week so far. Um, we're a little bit later than normal, and that's because I was lucky enough to win a scholarship to attend the spring symposium from Metalworks. So they've been doing presentations all day. And the last one just finished, and that was with an amazing artist named Denise Wallace, who draws upon her Native American heritage and creates these really amazing Northwestern inspired pieces, which are pretty cool. I really like them. I really love narrative work, so I really appreciate her kind of aesthetic. Anyway, so we've been super busy, lots of things in the works. I don't know if William has mentioned this or not, but we have been in conversation with one of our friends. They are shifting focus in their career, and so they were in the bead industry, and they've got some more fun things planned, but they're planning to kind of exit out what they're working on right now. So they are looking for a buyer for inventory and for molds to produce that work. So we are in conversation right now with hopefully acquiring it. So that means we're going to have to do another big push for, fundraising. Winter is, this year was pretty hard. Winter in general is a lean time for us. So it's not like we're necessarily rolling in the money in the winter. And William and I had a conversation about this um, not too long ago. And I think we both realize that we have these kind of unrealistic expectations in the sense that we think that the business is always going to be, popping and we're going to be, paying down things. But we've been doing it for about 10 years now. So we know the pattern. And in our minds, we know winter is going to be slow, and yet somehow we're always kind of disappointed that winter isn't more robust. So, anyways, so we had this conversation not too long ago about how we have to kind of manage our expectations and kind of be okay with winter not necessarily being like bustling, and maybe work on other things, to help supplement things, especially when they're slower. And hopefully we're starting to kind of lay the groundwork for that. Um, I don't know how much she's talked to you about certain things, but we are working really hard on a lot of different projects. So we're working on building up, of course, Star Cottage Studio. And we are also working on doing pop up shops, and I'm working with Touchstone and Contemporary Craft, and hopefully a couple of other secret things in the works. So, yeah, there's just a lot. All right. If you're out there, let me know you're watching, and let me know where you're tuning in from. It's always fun to see how far the signal gets boosted, I know it's a little bit weird because we're on a little bit later than normal. Not too much late, but yeah. So as I mentioned, I was in a symposium earlier, and so she was showing. She did a presentation about the last one. Denise Wallace was doing a presentation about her work, and then they did a tour of her studio, and then she showed some of her scrimshaw techniques, which was pretty cool. So yeah, so I really enjoyed that. So anyways, let's see who's watching. Cindy's watching from Miami. Hello. Marianne is watching. Howdy. I see lots of YouTube people, um, which is pretty cool. So, if you didn't know, we are trying to get 1,000 followers by the end of March, which is coming up fast, super fast. So, the goal is to reach that. I did a post on my personal timeline, but we'll probably do one on our business page, trying to um, excite people to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Once we get to 1,000 subscribers, it unlocks a couple different things, and we're able to do more. Also, if there are active participants out on YouTube, we'll spend more time developing content for YouTube. But it's kind of like the chicken and the egg syndrome. Like, do you make all this content and then maybe like 4 people watch it? Or do you go where your people are? So it's a little bit kind of like what, how do you do that? But we're trying, so that's all we can do is do our best. And hopefully, with the support of all of you out there, we'll be able to make it happen. Um, One of our friends, they are really popular on YouTube. They said that once you get to the 10,000 mark, like your channel is actively promoted, and it really, like, you don't have to try as hard, but like there's so many people trying to get on YouTube and other social media, um, that if you don't have very many people watching, so you need subscribers and you also need watch hours. So if you don't really have those, they push your ranking down lower. And so it's harder for random people to find your content. But if you have certain numbers, then then they're like, oh, well, people are actually watching these things and liking them. So we'll, push them higher up in the search features. So, you know, we're working on trying to build that up. So there's a lot of reasons why we're doing that. I think one of the biggest ones is that we don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket. Um, Also, we're in this kind of limbo state where, we're trying to grow things or grow our business. Um, and there are certain kind of glass ceilings. And we knew about several of them. Like, our town is a town of 1,500 people. So, like my high school, our graduating class had more people than the whole population of the town. Um, so it's kind of like, we knew that we would never become like, how make the numbers that a store with critical mass would. um, so we knew that you kind of had to moderate your expectations, especially for such a niche business as ours. um, Maybe if we were selling something else, like restaurants, if somebody goes to a restaurant, they're going to eat generally. But with our kind of store, you have to spend time with it and know what you're kind of going into, or are willing to take the time to learn. So, we knew that in the store, the physical location, there were certain barriers. And so, a part of understanding that, we've always tried to build community broader than just the town limits. So, that's why we're here and doing things like this so that we can reach more people. So, this is all about reaching more people, not so much that we're concerned about. The quantity of people. Like, some people are really into this like fame game. I don't really care about that so much, because I really do feel like the quality of our support network is, top notch, and we couldn't ask for a better group of people rooting us on. But the thing is that like you can only do, it's like you eventually you like plateau. So we've reached a certain level where if we want to grow, we have to start finding new ways of doing that. So that's kind of where we're at now. So if you are like, what is he talking about? I thought we were going to talk about texturing metal. We are going to do that, but I was doing my opening spiel. So yeah, so I'm going to check in on the comments. Hey, Norma. Hey, Susan. Um, uh, Marion said Sarah copied your post too. I don't know what that means, but good. I like Sarah. She's nice. And Terry says hello. Awesome. All right. So yeah. So we're gonna do some texturing of metal. So one of the things that a comment that kind of, it didn't really bother me necessarily, but it did put me start to think. Like I'm super fortunate, I'm super blessed to be able to be standing in a studio and have a lot of equipment. It took years and years of work to get to this point, and I'm still building it up. So it's like a never-ending thing. But somebody said, I wish that I had the equipment to make the things that you're making. And I was like, in my mind, I was like, oh yeah, like you could totally do that. So if you didn't see, last week we made some copper cuff bracelets. I think they turned out pretty cool. I'm still trying to figure out where all this stuff is. I think they're really fun. I like them. So we talked about that. So they said that they'd wish that they had access to the equipment and to the tools. And so I thought for this week, instead of doing something as specialized, I would try to focus on things that were pretty inexpensive to do and still have a fairly dramatic result. And I'm really into metal right now. So, yeah. Oh, also, and this is another ditch we're trying to dig. And when I say that, I mean it in the most loving sort of way. But when I was a freelancer and I was working for like books and magazines and designing jewelry and doing all these little things, I kind of equated it to being a ditch digger. And so you're digging a ditch, you don't know if it's going to rain or not, but you're digging it and you're working hard. And maybe there's a little bit of a trickle. And so the goal is if you dig enough ditches and there's enough trickles, then it adds up to enough water, or money, aka money, to keep your creative boat afloat, as they say, which means pay your bills. So, so when I was a freelancer, like I was always hustling to do whatever jobs I could with that in mind, because if you didn't work, maybe it didn't affect you right away, but down the road, maybe that's something that would be an issue. So I kind of think about that. It's kind of like diversifying your revenue streams so that you're not solely dependent on one thing. Um, I feel like with the jewelry world, it's very feast or famine. And some people are really lucky and they work really hard, and the opportunity meets the preparation, as Oprah says. And, they strike it big. Kendra Scott, she started off making jewelry at the bead store, and now she has more money than Beyonce. So I'm not exaggerating on that little factoid there, but that's an actual true story of somebody who like hit it big. But for the most of us, it's a very up and down, like when there's a lot of good opportunities, then you know, you have good opportunities and you have to kind of make hay while the sun is shining, as they say. So what I was saying was one of the other things that we're doing is we have started a Patreon account, and we've just rejigged the tiers a little bit so that they're a little bit more manageable. And for a while there, we didn't have that much to post about because things could kind of lagged a little bit. But we're gearing up towards a lot of things, and I'm not going to say too much right now because I want the Patreon people to see it first. So if you're over there, it's Patreon. Let me see if William has a banner for that. There it is. All right. So if you go over there to Patreon, you can see our progress with Star Cottage Studio. Most of the posts there are free, so they're public posts. So you don't worry about getting locked into another thing that people are asking money for. There is some paid tiers that you get little perks for being a supporter or a patron. So there are those, but a lot of the stuff is free. So, and there's a ton of content there. For a while when we were doing a lot of stuff, I was updating about Star Cottage Studio every single day, sometimes multiple times a day. So that's a good place to kind of check on that. But we've got a lot of stuff going on with that. And so, yeah, I've been working on a lot of things, and I'm a little bit tired because I've been working really, 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 really hard. Yeah. All right, let's turn this back to this and go back to the comments. Yeah. All right. So, hey, Harry. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put my apron on. I don't want to mess up my sweater. This is my Mr. Rogers kind of moment of the lie. Put my safety glasses on so I don't damage the money makers. And I put my apron on so that I kind of like it. It's kind of like I'm gonna get to work kind of vibe. There's a lot of things that they talk about. Like I study about creativity a lot, and particularly different people and their creative practices. And the reason why I do that is they think it's really fascinating to see how people do things and why people do things and what that produces in their work. And so there's a thing called behavioral conditioning. And it's one of those things where there's a process of rituals. So daily rituals and routines. So a ritual, you may be thinking that I'm going to get the bell, book, and candle out. But really, a ritual is any process that is repeatable that has a desired outcome. So, for instance, if you brush your teeth every day, you're not going to get cavities or as many cavities. It's kind of things like that. So when you apply these different concepts of creativity and behavioral conditioning, there are little tricks that you can play on yourself. You're doing them, so it's not like a surprise. But so like if you have a work outfit, if you wear that work outfit, then you'll be ready to work. You're kind of setting yourself up for success in that way. So it's kind of like they do tests with animals where they play a song and then then the animals do things during that song, and then whenever that song comes on, then they expect to do that. So like when I was going to high school, there was a lot of uh, I don't want to call us guinea pigs, but we were basically test subjects for different kind of things. So they would play certain sounds, and your brain would be like, they're trying to trigger you to have different responses. And so one of the kind of like learning techniques that they did was whenever you were studying, you listened to music, and whenever you heard that song, which you could play in your mind, it would act as like a mnemonic device that would trigger your memory recall. So I think it's really fascinating. I'm not really into the brain stuff as much as William. He's more into the science aspect of it, which I think is neat and kind of cool. But I'm more into the creative uh, spirit of it more. But I think that, there are places when kind of science and spirituality and creativity and that kind of other factor, they meet, and they can be really interesting where they meet. So anyways, yeah, so I put on my apron, I'm ready to work. So that's one of those things that whenever I'm going to do videos, you'll see me do that. Not only as a safety measure, but it's also a thing that makes me know that it's time to get to work. And hopefully for all of you too. So I've really been interested in copper lately. And one of the biggest reasons is that it's affordable. Um, and even though copper prices have gone up, you can still do a lot of techniques fairly inexpensively in copper. And so one of the things that I implore you to do is to go out into the world and look at alternative sources. There are a lot of wonderful jewelry supply companies, and I love them, and I visit their websites every day pretty much, and I enjoy all that they have to offer. However, there are alternatives. So go to your auto body shops and check out what they've got. There are certain sandpapers and things like that jewelers kind of keep as a secret, but it's the same stuff. And generally speaking, you can get more of it for cheaper. So, in regards to copper, there's a lot of different places that you can find copper in non jewelry applications. And we're going to talk about one of them, but I like flashing on buildings. There's a little wheel, a little device, and I don't know if I have it handy dandy. I don't. But anyways, it's kind of like a circle, and I thought it was over here somewhere. Like I said, I'm in the process of moving my studio around, so it's kind of a mess. But anyways, so there's a little circle of metal, and it's got different little kind of cutouts on the sides, and those little teeth or grooves in the side you use to check the thickness of the metal, and it will tell you the gauge of the metal. They also have that for drill bits, so that you know what size the drill bit is and also what gauge the wire is. So those are super handy to have if you don't have one already. So if you go to the hardware store or your home improvement store, you can get copper flashing. Now it's super important that you get pure raw copper. And the reason why is sometimes things will be copper plated, and they'll be made of aluminum, which if you're doing kind of sculptural things and you don't really care what the metal is, that's fine. However, it is going to be a different metal. So you just have to keep that in mind and act in accordance. Because not all metals are the same. Aluminum is super super light and super soft, and it's a different beast, so to say, as copper. So yeah, So if you do go, there are a lot of different places that you can find copper as a raw material. One of the things is we at the same hardware store, I got some very thick gauge copper wire, which we use to make these bangles. There's also copper pipes. So sometimes you can get copper pipes there. And sometimes people get, they're demoing their buildings and stuff, and you can get copper from that and do some really cool things with that. There's a process called air chasing, which is really cool. So there's that. So yeah, there's a lot of different places. Wire is another thing. Before, when I lived in New York, sometimes going to Melliferous in Midtown was a hike. So I would just go to my little Ace True Hardware store and pick up the copper wire there and use that, and it's basically the same thing. You again have to make sure that it is bare, raw copper wire and that it's not coated. Now, if you do want coatings, there's a plethora of places that you can go to get coated craft wires. Softlex has a line called Craft Wire. Beetalon has a line called Artistic Wire that's a plated wire. So it just depends on what you're doing. But for me, I like the raw materials because I know what I can do with those things. Like with raw copper, you can enamel it, you can do different things, you can, you kind of know what's in the ingredients. It's kind of like knowing, um, when you're cooking and you say, "Oh, um, I need barbecue sauce, but I only have ketchup," and you can kind of uh, finagle it. It's easier just to buy the barbecue sauce, but sometimes if you have the different raw ingredients, like, oh, I have tomatoes, you can make it from scratch or modify things to make it work. All right, so let's get to it before we get too out of control. But like I was saying, one of the reasons why I've been working with copper a lot is because I'm trying to build my skills as well as I do these things. So in the background, which I'm not always showing things, is I'm doing a lot of kind of process learning. Um, and one of the things that I'm doing a lot of right now is working with a hydraulic press. I'm super fortunate to be the artist in residence for the metal studio at Contemporary Craft, and they have a beautiful hydraulic press. And so whenever I'm there to work, I am pretty much on the hydraulic press nonstop. And so that's one of my big kind of learning curves right now. And then basically just how metal moves. So I've been doing a lot of reading and research on fold forming and different ways of manipulating the metal and different raising. We made these little bowls the other 2 weeks ago, maybe. I can't remember. But we made these little copper bowls, and I think they're really fun. And you could take what we're doing in today's kind of lesson and adapt it to things like this. So all these things kind of interconnect. So you can do different things and build upon them. Like if you made this twisted wire and you solder this together, you could make like a foot on a bowl, or you could make this into a great big chunk and pendant, So there's a lot of different options for how to incorporate all these different little different techniques and weave them together. And then you can kind of form your own kind of creative cloth. All right, so I'm going to flip this around and then we'll get started. So you'll see the ceiling for a second. I don't know where the camera is. I'm trying not to do too much with pushing buttons, because the other day I accidentally turned everything off. All right, so this is a very messy but true to life depiction of the studio. So we talked. If you looked at the description of this video, it's about texturing metal. And one of the things I mentioned earlier is I wanted to show different alternatives that didn't cost an arm and a leg to get started. So one of the places that you can also find copper is getting these copper washers. Now these are super fun because they come in different sizes and they tell you the different sizes. And this is a nice little hack if you don't have a a disc cutter, which is one of these things over here. I was punching out some brass earlier. So if you don't have one of these, this is a way to kind of fudge it. And you can actually do different things with this. So you can dome these out and turn them into bead caps, and there's all different kinds of things. But for today, we're going to talk about texturing metal. So there are some things that you do need. You do need a hammer. And I have this nice hammer. This is a Brenda Schwader. Now that's a hammer. It's a Fretz hammer. So it's on the pricier side. I had to save up for a long time to get these. But if you don't have this, you're not completely sunk. You can get an inexpensive rivet hammer. And a rivet hammer looks like this. And is maybe $8. Sometimes you can find them on sale. These are not super high quality hammers. These are kind of just like, it's no frills. But the thing is that you can always adapt your tools and change them and make them more, you can customize them. And that's one way that you can take an inexpensive tool and give it more value. So, for instance, if you wanted a tip that was more like this one, then you could take your sandpaper and sand this down, because straight out of the box, this is a little bit sharp. But you could sand this down starting at the lowest grit, which the lowest grit removes material, higher grits polish. So you would start maybe at like 100 grit or 80 grit even, and work your way up to about 2000 grit. And by that time, you'll have a mirror finish. And then you can buff it on a buffing wheel and get similar results. Now, if you wanted to have a more ergonomic handle, you could also wrap the handle with vet wrap, which, if you don't know what that is, it looks like this. But before I digress too much, because I could talk about tool modification all day long, so instead, we're going to do the description says. So you can use this. This is a great tool to use, especially if you don't have one of these hammers yet. It is a nice hammer. As somebody described it, it's a sexy hammer. And so it's a nice hammer. But you don't necessarily need that to get started if you're on a budget. So you can use this. But since I have this one, I'm going to use this one. So you can use these washers straight out of the containers and they work fine. However, if you want to get the most bang for your buck with texture, you can anneal your metal. If you've watched any of the last couple tutorials that I've done, I've shown the whole process of annealing copper. If people want, I can show that again, but really, I mean, you know, I've done it so many times now. So if you want me to do it, let me know in the comments. If not, we'll just skip ahead. I don't really see anybody saying if they want it or not, but if you do want it, then let me know. All right. So if you don't have, if you're like, whoa, I don't even have money for the $8 hammer. If you have a regular hammer, or this is a really abused cheapy chasing hammer. If you have this and you have a couple different flathead screwdriver punches or chisels, you can pick those up at yard sales and different places for super, super cheap. You know, less than, sometimes you can get them for you know, a quarter, you know, depending on where you're at. Sometimes they'll just give them away for free if you're nice, you know. So so yeah, so you can get some different bits and pieces and make those into your own. So here are some that I've already added the textures, and I'll have to zoom in a little bit closer so that you get an idea of what's possible. Now, all of these techniques here were done with tools that were very inexpensive. And so you can definitely do this, and you don't need to have a ton of money to do this. Now, you will need some kind of bench block. If you have a steel bench block, they're not super expensive. This is one. This is a 6-inch block. I have this wrapped up because I use it for the chasing and repoussé stuff that I do. And I don't like it to get all covered in plasticine. So that's why that's wrapped up still. But if you get a bench block, you can use that and use it to, you know, it's a really useful thing. I've seen people use railroad tracks that have been cut into an anvil. I feel like those are deceptively more expensive than just getting a piece of steel. Because then they're like, oh, it's an anvil, but it's, you know, it is and it isn't. So you can definitely do that. And sometimes you can find anvils. There's ones that, you know, are from Harbor Freight that are really inexpensive. They're not really great anvils, but if you're in a pinch and you don't have anything else, then feel free to use them. And, you know, it may break, but in that case, you need to do a different thing. Also, with those anvils, and I'll show you one. With these anvils, there's a texture on the surface, so you do have to polish that down. Otherwise, if you don't polish it down, that will leave a mark on your metal, and it does what a process called telegraphing. So you don't want that to happen, or maybe you do, in which case then don't polish it. But if you want it to stay pristine, your metal to stay pristine, then you'll want a smooth surface. So use that in your bench block. Now, the other thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to position your block over the leg of your table. Now, we built these tables and they're fairly sturdy, but if you are in an area that you don't know, if you have like a plastic folding table, you know, you may want to move, but if you have like a sturdier plastic table, you can still use it. However, position your bench block over the leg of your table. Because if you do it in the middle of the table, it will have a lot of bounce and stuff, and it will mess you. You won't get as full of a force as you could. Now, there's a couple of other things that you can do that will make your life a lot easier. And if you're going to do any kind of stamping, it's a good idea to get a brass hammer. Now, I had a friend one time who, I'm not going to name names, but they went and they wrote the nastiest review of these brass hammers. And they're like, it's chewed up and I'm blah, 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 blah. And they went on and on about how terrible it is. However, they did not understand the purpose of the brass hammer. So brass is softer than steel. And when you have a punch or a stamp, they're steel. And if you have a really nice stamp, they're tool steel that have been tempered and hardened, and they do a process that they use on knives that hardens this part and keeps this part soft. And sometimes they don't. But if you have steel on steel, and then you have a metal piece underneath, and you have a steel bench block underneath, eventually the stamp will wear out. I know, it sounds crazy, but if you use this enough, eventually this texture will be no more. And you have to use it fairly aggressively. And I've seen people, they hammer the heck out of their things, and it's basically punching a hole through the metal, in my mind. And that's fine, but they have to be cognitive that eventually that stamp is going to wear out. And I can definitely tell. In the early times, I got a letter stamp set and I used a steel hammer, and it worked for years and years. But then I started noticing that some of the letters were not as crisp as they used to be. And that's because this letter was wearing down. So I can attest to that for a fact. So the reason why a brass hammer is good for stamping is because when you are hitting it, imagine I'm hitting it, this absorbs some of that blow, but it still gives the force of the blow and the weight of the blow, because this is I think it's I can't remember how many pounds this hammer is, but it still delivers that force into your stamp, so it goes into the metal surface. However, it's not going to mushroom out your head. So there's two things. One of it is it prevents it from dulling your stamp. The other thing is it prevents it from mushrooming out the head of your stamp. Now, if you hit this enough, what's going to happen is it's going to flatten out and curl over. And some people think that's cool. They're like, oh yeah, it shows that it's been used. However, if you are going to use the steel hammer and you are going to use it and you are going to mushroom out the head of your stamps, you have to take care of those and make sure you file those down fairly periodically, because sometimes what happens is you'll be hammering, and that metal will create a rim, and then it will get thinner and thinner until it breaks off, and it's like a splinter of doom, and it usually will aim for your eyeball hole. So you don't want the splinter of doom to enter your eyeball hole, because if you get the splinter of doom in your eyeball hole, then you're going to have problems and you're going to have to go to the ER, and somebody's going to have to go and fish around your eyeball for slivers of metal. And so don't do that. It's not great. And it's happened to people before. It didn't happen to me yet, knock on wood. So if you are going to do that, make sure you take care of your stamps, and they'll last a really long time, and you'll be putting yourself at less risk. So anyways, so this will get chewed up, and that's to be expected. This is supposed to get chewed up. This is supposed to wear down and get all kinds of gnarly. And the reason is this gets gnarly and this doesn't. So your stamp lasts a lot longer. And the thing that actually takes more work to produce is the thing and is more expensive will last a lot longer than the thing that's not. Now, of course, you can always recondition your hammers and sand down and polish and buff your hammer and get it back to looking like it better than it did coming out of the factory. So just keep that in mind. These are fairly inexpensive. Impress are they produce a line of tools and they're really inexpensive. And so sometimes the quality is not always comparable to the higher end, but sometimes if you don't have money for a $200 hammer, then you got to go with the $10 hammer. So in that way you kind of get what you pay for, but at the same time I do think that they're good for what you pay. So there are other brands out there that are not good at all and basically fall apart in your hand the moment you pick them up and touch them. I was in a class with somebody and they brought a hammer and they started hammering and the hammer had just flew off and flew across the room and busted up a bunch of stuff. And luckily nobody got hurt, but their hammer basically fell apart. So it is good and I always say it's the best thing you can do is get the best that you can afford. And sometimes you have to work towards things and set goals for yourself. It took me a really long time to get a frets hammer. And I love my frets hammers. But it took me a long time. For a long time, I used this one. I also wasn't doing what I'm doing now, so I could get away with it. But anyways, let's skip forward. So these are washers. You can add texture to these washers without annealing them. As you can see here, I've added textures to this copper and this straight out there. These ones have been annealed and they are dead soft. Now, you may be saying, well, this came out of the package. It should be dead soft. However, whenever they're punched out, they use a punch almost like the hydraulic press to punch these out. And that process work hardens the washers. Now, it doesn't work harden them super hard, but because you can still add texture, but it does work harden them. So if you anneal these, use a torch. You can use a creme brulee torch, and those are fairly inexpensive, and you can get that set up for pretty cheap, and that's a really good essential to have anyways. But if you don't, you can always use just straight out of the package. So this is the riveting hammer end on this, and I've got this positioned over my uh, over the leg of the table. And when I'm doing this, I'm going to hit up and down like this. And I'm not going to hit super, super hard. I'm going to give it enough force, but not too much, because you can actually cut your metal with a hammer. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to remain in the same place and move the metal underneath. So this way you have more precision over where your hammer strikes fall. All right, so that's how to kind of create that starburst. Now, one thing I would recommend is grab a piece of sandpaper and hit those edges, because sometimes when you're doing this, for one, the manufacturing process, like I said, is using a die, and so sometimes they're a little bit sharp, And these are not designed for jewelry in mind, so they don't really care if it's sharp or not, you know? So just take a piece of sandpaper and knock down those sharp edges, and then you'll be good to go. All right. So that's that kind of sunburst texture. Now with the chasing hammer, and if you don't have a riveting hammer, you can always take the flat screwdriver and hold it and hit it and like this. You know, it's a little bit harder, but you know, it is practice for controlling holding like chasing tools. So this is a ball peen hammer. This is a really inexpensive one. And you can get a nice pretty hammered effect if you use the ball part. You can see it's got a beautiful hammered texture. I love hammered texture. So I'm in it to win it for this. Now you may have noticed that I have this little rivet, this hole punching riveter. Now this is not an inexpensive tool. However, this has lasted many years, and if you use it properly, it will last many more years. For a long time, I didn't have a flex shaft, believe it or not, but I had this tool, and that enabled me to punch holes all day long with different things, and I still use it. And if these do eventually break from metal fatigue, generally speaking, you can buy replacements, and it's no problem. So this is Crafted Findings, and you can even get their little rivet system. And all you have to do is line it up. Generally speaking, I like to put a little Sharpie mark of where I want that dot to be, and then, or where I want that hole to be, and I will line it up like so. And then you just twist. Now I'm holding this stationary while I twist. This is a little bit thicker, so it is going to take a little bit more force. I don't go all the way down. If you go all the way down, this little punch part right here, it will leave a mark on the top of your metal. So just keep that in mind when you are punching your hole, that you don't go too far down, and then you don't end up, you end up with, a wonky thing. So there's that hole in there, and this could be in a pair of earrings, it could be a bracelet component, could be a pendant for your hammer or for a necklace, and dangle things off of it, all kinds of things. If if your piece gets distorted while you're hole punching, just go back over on the back and just do a quick little texture on the back. Not too much, because if you do too much, the steel of your bench block will remove the texture that you already created. You could always do it on wood, and that's one way that's not going to get hammered off from the underneath. So there's hammer texture. All right, so we did the starburst. All right, so another tool that you'll need, and it's really helpful to have, is called a center punch. And this is basically, and if you don't have this, you could make your own out of a filed nail that it's been hardened. So if you don't know the hardening process, it's a little bit challenging. But you can, and they're not too expensive. So you can find these sometimes cheap. So, if you look on Facebook Marketplace, sometimes you find these in machinist tools, or at garage sales or yard sales. And people always seem to accumulate stuff like this. Like, I just bought a thing of tools. Like, granted, it needs a little bit of TLC, but those were it was $20 for the box. So I got a couple of hammers. I took some of them out already. I got some dividers, some different measuring devices. So keep your eyes peeled, and sometimes you can find a good deal. All right, so, but this is with a center punch. Like I said, you could probably use a nail, but it would eventually wear out. So just use a center punch. And then it will leave a mark. So what a center punch is when you hit it, it leaves a little dimple. And generally speaking, then you would take a drill bit and you would put the drill bit in there and drill that as the hole. And it keeps your drill bit from skittering and marking up your metal. So that way it keeps it in place and it keeps it from wandering around. But for us, we're going to use it as a texture. And this is one of my favorite textures because you have control. And if you wanted to do this and be like stippling, you could, if you wanted to take a piece of copper, you could definitely do some drawing techniques with your center punch. And if you don't know what stippling is, it's when you make a drawing up of little dots, almost like pixels. Did you all have to do that when you were in any arts classes? But so this is a more kind of uniform. If you notice, I started on one side and then went to the other and then did the kind of cardinal points. And then that was evenly spaced. This is more random. So it just depends what you like. If you like it to be more even or if you want it to be more random, it's up to you. Now I do. I did get some stamps. Now these are Native American stamps. There's a wonderful book by Matthew Chimney, and it's called The Art of Stamping, and he shows you how to make these metal stamps. I actually took a virtual workshop with him on how to make these stamps, and it's surprisingly. I don't want to say it's complicated, but it's a little bit complicated. But you can definitely do it. It just is. It's sometimes it's just easier. You can go to the Thunderbird Supply and buy these fairly inexpensively. But if you really want to be hardcore and make them, you can make them. But this is, they filed this down to make a diamond shape, and then they used a saw, a jeweler saw, to create a cross pattern, crisscross pattern on them. So then they tempered it and did all that stuff. So I'm gonna get that brass hammer out. And you may notice that I'm doing light taps first. And that's kind of my natural rhythm. I'm not actually doing, this isn't actually doing anything, but it helps me guide my stamp. Or actually the hammer to hit the stamp. So this is kind of looks like a wreath. Or almost like a lens aperture, if you know what I'm talking about. So this is done a little bit more organically and towards the metal. And this is a little bit different. Just the angle is different, but it's got a different look. Now, if you wanted to, you can go back and if there's any spaces where there's any empty spots, you can fill those spaces in with your center punch. And add texture that way as well. And I'm not hitting it super hard. Now, you will notice that the metal is flaring out on the sides a little bit wherever it's getting pushed out by the punch. So that's when the handy dandy sandpaper comes in handy, and you just kind of knock down the edges. If it's really bad, you can file them, but that's a good way of doing that. Now, you can always take a piece of sandpaper and fold it and run around the edges so it fits in the creases, so that even in the inside it's taken care of. And so yeah, so there's one way. Now I noted I mentioned before that this hammer is a little bit chewed up, and one of my favorite textures comes from when the hammer gets all kind of messed up. And it has kind of a more kind of a rough silk vibe. So it's a real subtle texture, but it's a texture. You can kind of see it. Now, the thing that you'll want to do is clean these with Dawn dish detergent or a surfactant like this. This is called surfactant. It's basically anything that keeps the oils off, and then scrub this from the oil, and then you can dip these in liver of sulfur, and it will blacken your pieces. And then you take a polishing cloth and shine up all the high spots, and you won't and it will really bring out the detail. Now, if you wanted, you could also take wire and cut pieces of wire off and sew those on to your pieces, either by punching a hole like we did earlier, or you take your little piece of wire and bend over a little L at the end. This is 22 gauge copper. And you can put this on your little piece like so. Or if there's a couple different ways you can do it. I like to do a technique where you're putting this underneath and you're wrapping this over. And then that way you don't have the little sharp part poking out. So you just kind of wrap this around. Sometimes it's a little tricky at first getting it started, but you can definitely do this. And you don't necessarily need a ton of tools for this. I will say that if you have the chain nose pliers, it will make your life a lot better and easier. And they're just kind of like the essentials for in your jewelry making kit. And then you can use your chain nose pliers to tighten up your work. So if you get to the part where you're happy with it, you go back over and tighten it real tight and flatten it down. And that's how you can kind of build this up. Now you can do this as tightly as you want. If you do this super tight, it will have a more machined look. If you do this kind of messy, you can have a more kind of organic, you know, a more naturalistic looking kind of vibe. And so I'm just squeezing the wire down. Now I'm going to show you one more technique, and then I think that will be it. And that's contingent if I can find the steel wire. All right, I'm going to just tighten this up one more time. There you go. And that's a nice way to add texture to your piece. And in theory, I have a cutter somewhere, and I could cut this, and it has a nice kind of adds a nice little wire wrap texture to that. Especially on that kind of, I like that texture. That's sunburst texture with that coiled look. So I'll trim this back and then kind of tuck that in later. Now, if you have steel wire, now this is called iron binding wire, and you can use steel wire. You can get that at the hardware store. Brenda uses it. Brenda Schwader uses it a lot. Actually, if you get a thicker wire, it will work out a little bit better. But basically, you can manipulate. Let me move this so you can actually see what I'm doing. So you can manipulate this into little zigzags or swirls or whatever. And I'm just going to do a kind of a spiral. And you don't want to cut these with your good cutters because this will chew up your wire super fast because it's steel wire. So if I just made this little spiral, and then I'm going to go on my annealed copper, which is this one. And I'm going to lay this over my copper washer. And then I'm going to hammer that. And what this does is the steel is harder than the copper. So you're getting an impression on your copper piece because it's softer. So if you had a bigger sheet of copper and you made this into letters or whatever, you could lay out a pattern almost like you're doing cloisonne and then hammer it, and it's a type of printing on the metal. So that's one way that you can add. Another way you can add texture to your copper pieces. All right. So I'm going to flip this around. All right. So does anybody have any questions? I know most of you all who watch these regularly or who have done metal smithing kind of stuff, you probably already know all these things. So hopefully you weren't too bored. Otherwise, we just got to spend time together, and that's nice too. So hopefully you all are doing well out there. And if you like these tutorials and you want to see more, let us know. If there are any specific techniques or things you'd like to see, it's always helpful to see what people are interested in because then we can kind of tailor what we do. And then I'm not just randomly picking something. So, yeah, so that's fun. And if you like these tutorials, the best way to do that is to purchase things from the shop. That's a way that we can stay in business and pay our mortgages and do all the things that we're doing. And we're not charging for these things. Usually, if we had a class at the shop, if we did an open table class, you have to pay for materials, and the teacher's there and will help you. But you have to buy materials to do that. And if it was a specialized class, like some of these things, or we went pretty in depth with like chasing and repoussé and some of the other things. So those ones you'd have to pay a lot of money for. So if you like these little tutorials and you want to keep them free, the best thing to do is to head on over to allegorygallery.com and show your support there. And that's one way that we can keep the lights on and keep the content free flowing and accessible for everybody. But if I have to get a real job, then, you know, I'm not making videos. All right. So thanks so much for hanging out with me. I hope you had fun, and I will talk to you all later. All right. Have a great night, everybody. Bye.